We had been up at a place called the Rock Pile. We were there for about 3 weeks, running local patrols around there. Then another outfit came in to replace us, and we started out on what was I think a first-time situation in terms of where we were going. I don't think any main force units had been down that area before. We went south and then started going west towards Quezon. Now, there was nothing at Quezon at that point. It was into the Quezon Valley, and we could see there was a valley. I've never heard of it, didn't know of anything, didn't know what it was going to become and what was going to happen there. But we were just going through some jungle trails, and we did notice that the trails had obviously been used a lot. And there were holes alongside the trails where you could jump if you started getting mortar fire or something. So obviously the NVA had built those trails. It wasn't just, pure jungle. And my company and my platoon in particular, we were on the point for that. We were the lead platoon on that as we started out that way.
Yeah.
And we got up to where we were going to spend the night. And again, we were just in jail on trails. And it was not a place where you could form a real defensive perimeter. So we just slept in our tents just in a long, big straight line along the trail.
Wow.
And the first night, I think we heard a couple of mortar rounds hit not too far away, but nobody was hurt. And then we got up the next day, and we went out ahead, and we went off the trail for a ways just to do that. And the other platoons in my company stayed on the trail. And the battalion was still about a half a day's march behind us. And we could hear them coming up the next morning. The battalion was coming up the trail we had come up the day before. And we were sitting right next to that trail. Most of the company was, and I was off a little bit further. So my platoon came back down, and we joined up with the rest of our company. And then the battalion, we could hear them coming up. Marine rifle companies are not very quiet. We're not the sneaky guys.
Yeah.
We got so much ammunition, metal hanging off of you. You're slipping and sliding in the jungle, and you're just making a lot of noise. We could hear them coming from a mile away. And about the time they got to where they were going to link up with us, all of a sudden the firing started. And I think that maybe the NVA were probably there maybe to ambush the point or the people in the front of that rest of the battalion that was coming up. And we had come back down from where we'd spent the night and were behind them. So I think they were surprised because it was not a big group. I don't think. I think we ended up with 6 or 8 bodies. But so it was not really a planned thing. It was just something that happened in the middle of the jungle.
Yeah.
And it was a very dense jungle. You couldn't see very far. You couldn't see who was shooting at who. When we got up there as a battalion, the first place we went was the Rock Pile. And there had been a major battle at the Rock Pile before we were there. And there were pretty good trenches. um, much more than I'd seen before down in the Da Nang area. And that was the time, and there was a place called Mutter Ridge.
Mhm.
Okay, Mutter Ridge runs east-west, just barely south of the DMZ.
Yeah.
And the west end of Mutter Ridge is pretty close to the rock pile. The Mutter Ridge battle was going on while we were at the rock pile.
When you were at the rock pile, were you able to hear what was happening on Mutter's Ridge?
We could hear and we could see.
You could see.
We could see I mean, it's, you know, we're probably a mile from where the action was actually taking place. But you could, the airplanes were flying up to drop bombs. And we just watch them fly.
How long did that firefight last, the one you were describing where the NVA got between you and the other Marines? Roughly, I know you wouldn't have an exact time.
It didn't last all that long, but it was very intense. You know, it lasted initially probably 10 minutes. And then it died down. And then all of a sudden it started up again for just a few more minutes.
Yeah. You said that when you were going to Vietnam, you were looking forward to the opportunity of being a Marine officer in a combat situation. Did the actual experience of combat alter your thinking at all, or change your thinking at all about combat?
Well, every combat experience is different. It was not rinse, repeat, and rinse again like World War I, where they just kept doing the same thing over and over. You know, when we were down in Da Nang, most of the combat was very short. Most of it was, you know, just a sniper or two, and we'd fire back, and they'd quit sniping, and we'd quit firing back. We didn't get involved in too much in the way of intensity there. But the real problem down in Da Nang was the mines and booby traps.
You and your animal patrol.
Yeah, they were responsible for most of our casualties.
What was your perception, or what is your assessment of the NVA? We've talked about NVA. Did you also face some Viet Cong?
Yeah, we had Viet Cong down in Da Nang.
Right, so you get a bit south. What is your assessment of the NVA and of the Viet Cong as fighting forces?
Well, we actually had a talk about that during the time.
Mm.
And we called the VC Charlie. And when we got up to the DMZ and went through some stuff up there, we called him Charles, and it was a sign of respect.
So the NVA was Charles.
Yeah.
And the VC was Charlie. So it sounds like then you had greater respect for the NVA than for the VC. Why was that?
Because they would stand and fight. The VC, they knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. I mean, you know, they weren't going to go head to head with you very often. Occasionally that happened, never in my experience, but I've heard of others. But they couldn't come close to our firepower.
Mm. So I'm going to ask you to, let's focus on the NVA, and then let's focus on the Marines. So you're fighting with Marines, you're fighting against NVA. And as you think about the NVA generally, and then I'll ask the same question about the Marines you fought with generally, What words would you use, if we boil these ideas down to, here's a typical NVA soldier, understanding that individuals will be different, but if we take your general perception of what the NVA were like and instill those in sort of what we would think of as the typical NVA soldier, how would you characterize that typical NVA soldier?
I've never really thought about that, but certainly they were good. We knew they were good, and we knew they were reasonably well supplied. They still couldn't match our firepower, but they were capable people.
Would the word tenacious apply?
You could apply it. I don't know that we thought about it that way, but as you look back, they had to be tenacious just to have gotten where they got the way they did. They endured a heck of a trip down to before they even got where we were.
So the trail, and then you mentioned you're in the Khe Sanh Valley before Khe Sanh, as we think of it, even exists. The place Khe Sanh. You're in the Khe Sanh Valley. Of course, there's the village there, but the Marine base isn't there yet. You mentioned that trail that comes along with the holes dug in along the side.
You kind of marveled at that. I mean, somebody's been here, obviously, preparing for stuff. And
a resourcefulness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the manpower. That it took a lot of manpower to dig those holes, and to have that. I mean, if they had been sitting in those holes and we'd been walking up that trail, they probably could have annihilated us.
The Marines that you are in command of course, each one has his own personality. They're going to be a little bit different, but again, if we sort of think of the Marines you served with in general, and then distill that into what we would call then a typical Marine, how would you characterize the typical Marine that you served with?
The Marines were tenacious, disciplined, and tough. I mean, it was a grinding experience, particularly that first trip up to the rock pile, and in that long battalion hike we took. When we came out of the jungle there, everybody had something wrong with them. You had a lot of guys, we called it trench foot. It wasn't really the same thing as the trench foot of World War I. You had a lot of sores on your feet. You were wet. You were just a mess.
Wet either because of training or because you're sweating, one of those two.
Both of those, yeah. And you have to walk through water. You walk through streams. You don't walk over them. You walk right through them, and some of them are pretty deep.
When you were in Da Nang, you witnessed some of the internal political, cultural problems that existed in South Vietnam. What sorts of things did you see that reflected the internal problems in South Vietnam?
Well, I'll tell you that when I first reported in, I mentioned that I was going to spend a week shadowing the other officer who was a platoon leader, and somewhere in there, I was there for 1 or 2 days, and we got a direction to go to a bridge because there was a South Vietnamese Ranger battalion that was coming up Highway 1 to join the revolution that was going on in Da Nang, and we were told to stop them. And at that time, I was just trailing this other platoon leader. And so we went over to that bridge, and we set up, and the company commander went with us also. And we set up the bridge at Tonquit, and this battalion rolled up with jeeps in the lead up Highway 1, and we stopped them, and there was a confrontation there. I was just told to go over there and get out of the way.
So the Marines are stopping South Vietnamese forces from joining a political uprising that's taking place in Da Nang.
Yes, that was our order.
And who was? I'm sorry. Who was rising up against the government in Da Nang?
It was the Buddhists. There was a conflict between the Buddhists and the Catholics. And Tu and Ki, who were the honchos down in Saigon at that point, were Catholics. And the Buddhists didn't agree with the Catholics. The Buddhists up in I Corps actually wanted to secede from South Vietnam and join North Vietnam. And so there was quite a hoo-ha going on in the Da Nang area and up all the way up to Hue.
Was this disconcerting to you? I mean, you're new in country, probably so far as you've been told, this is a war, Northern communism versus Southern non-communism, and then you get to South Vietnam and see that there's something of a civil conflict taking place within South Vietnam. Did that strike you at the time, or did you just sort of roll with it as it went?
I don't think I really appreciated what the problem was. I think South Vietnam was like a lot of third world countries. It pays to be in charge. Every village had a village chief, and everything that came into the village had to pay for the privilege of coming into the village, and the village chief made money. The real consequences to us became apparent later. But we went to that village, and we went to that bridge. We faced them down, and they rolled up an artillery piece and pointed it at our company commander, who was standing on the bridge. 105 millimeter cannon.
Wow.
And he stuck it out, and then he looked up in the sky, and there were some of our airplanes flying over with bombs on them, showing he said, "Well, you got that, I got those. We will annihilate you."
And this is U.S. Marines in a standoff with South Vietnamese military.
Yes.
Well, I guess they're not loyal to the government. Yeah, they're sort of rebels against their own government in military. Good grief. I mean, what that points to is just how complicated this situation was. So did these, I'm assuming these South Vietnamese forces then eventually backed off and went away?
They backed off. I don't know how long they went away. I think some of them eventually did get into Da Nang. But the real problem for us was that they had just left a compound that was being built for them with American help. And there were, I don't know how many, I've heard estimates from several hundred to several thousand Bouncing Betty mines in that compound that were being used as part of the perimeter defense. And the VC looted most of those. And so that gave them a tremendous supply of stuff to use against us.
The VC were able to loot those bouncing Bettys from the space being built partly or primarily by the Americans for the South Vietnamese military. Was that, in your assessment, because elements within that South Vietnamese military were basically in cahoots with the VC?
There may have been, I never got down to that level of knowledge,
Yeah.
but they had just abandoned that fort and they hadn't left anybody to guard all that ordnance.
Wow.
And so it became available to be used against us. And I resented our allies for
Yeah.
that, among other things.
Did you do any operations with ARVN forces after this?
Not too long after that, we had one.
How did it
It
go?
was kind of funny.
Oh,
We went on an operation called Operation Georgia. And this was the opening of the Anwa Valley. I like to, in my own mind, I characterize the strategy that we had been using all along was basically like a growing amoeba. If you remember, go life science classes, the amoeba gets bigger and bigger, and then it pops into two.
yeah.
Each one of them grows, and that was how we were kind of doing our guerrilla warfare earlier. And so we were trying to we moved into the Anwar Valley. That was as far as we ever went with the Vietnamese. And we were getting ready to go on an operation. We were going to fly out and fly out on helicopters, join up with some, I can't remember what level they were, but some local Vietnamese soldiers, and participate in some operations together. At that point, we had interpreters with us. And I can remember just my platoon was going to go out. And this was in late April. And we went out from An Hoa and we only had 2 helicopters to carry us. And it was about 100 degrees out. It was just miserably hot. And that when it's hot, helicopters can't lift as much as they can if it's cooler. So it seems to me that each of our H-34 helicopters could carry something like 6 people. And so I've got a platoon with probably, 40, 45 guys at least, because you have not only your own men, you have a couple of machine guns and usually a rocket team who are actually from a weapons platoon, but they spend most of their time with the rifle platoons. So I probably had about 40 guys to move out there and 2 helicopters to do it. So I sent out, I didn't go in the first group because I figured they needed as much firepower as they could get. And having a lieutenant with a 45 along is not much firepower. So, rifles and machine guns. So I sent out probably somewhere around 10 or 12 guys in the first load of the first, and the helicopters were slow. We were going pretty long. It's about a 10 or 15 minute round trip. So it's going to take me three or four round trips to get my whole platoon out there. So we're going to be an hour. And the first guys are going to be hanging out there themselves. So I had to get that. So, and our radios were pretty poor at that time. It was too far for us to have radio contact with the people on the ground. So we had to relay everything through the helicopters. We could talk to the helicopters and they could talk to the people on the ground. So the first wave went. And we're getting the word back from the helicopters while they're coming back. There's a lot of fire. There's a real firefight going on there, et cetera, et cetera. you'd be ready for a hot landing zone, meaning you could be taking fire as soon as you hit the ground. So I got everybody up. We said, okay, here's where we're going. We're going out next. We got 12 people, 6 in this one, 6 in this one. I'm going to be with you with my radio. I want you guys to figure out how you're going to line up. You're going to go as soon as you hit the deck, or as soon as the helicopter's down, you jump out, you go out and fan out one side, fan out the other side, and get ready, because it's a hot zone and there's a lot of fire. So we got down there, we jumped out, ready, everybody did what they're supposed to do, and everybody, you see these guys are all just sitting around picking their noses. There wasn't any fire. What's going on? Turns out that the fire was from those ARVN soldiers that in that village shooting some chickens to cook for lunch. And the helicopter guys thought it was incoming fire.
And if there happen to be any VC in the area, notifying them that, of course, I guess
they didn't tell us.
Yeah, I guess the helos would signal anyway, but
so I never trusted the ARVN after that. What in the world are you guys doing here?
Veterans sometimes say, when I arrived in Vietnam, I thought, I was ready to serve. I believed in the mission, and usually we're speaking of the fight against communism. And then they say, and then after, the first few weeks, you begin to notice things. And by the time a few months goes by, I've heard this a number of times from veterans, and I'm just wondering what you think, especially based on what we've heard in the past few minutes. I'll often hear, after a few months, this whole situation in South Vietnam just seems so crazy to me. It just didn't make any sense any longer. And at that point, it was all about just survive and get out of here whenever you can. What about your own thinking? It's different for you because you're in command, and so you're not just concerned about yourself, you're concerned about almost 50 other Marines, and maybe in a way that doesn't give you space to think about these other things. But how does that strike you when you hear the other veterans say, after a few months, seeing the kinds of things that you've described in the past few minutes, this just seems so crazy, it didn't make any sense at all to me?
Well, we were certainly getting to that point while we were down in Da Nang and dealing with the Army of the ARVN, or the Army of Vietnam people, and the local militia kind of guys. And because of that thing at the bridge, there was another incident that involved in that uprising as well. And because of that, guys are out there shooting chickens for lunch, stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder what's going on here.
And presumably those chickens belong to villagers, and so these ARVN are just basically taking villagers' chickens?
I presume that's the case.
Which is not going to do much to encourage those villagers to support the cause of the government of South Vietnam.
Yeah. There was one incident where we were sent to operate with 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, and in Da Nang. And my understanding of what we were doing, and this was our whole company going, is that we were going to go to set up a perimeter. And this was when all these riots and stuff were going on in Da Nang, not too long after the incident at the bridge. And we were put under the operational control of 2-4, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. And so we were told that we were going to get on trucks and go down, and we were going to provide security for a new compound that was being built for the senior Marine in Vietnam, General Walt. And so it was a nighttime thing. We got on trucks, and we had no idea where we were. We were just somewhere. We were on trucks and we were going down a road to get to this compound. And the compound was not in the main city of Da Nang. There's a river that runs through Da Nang. It was on the east side of the river. The Da Nang city is on the western side of the river.
Right.
And we got to that compound, and we went into a building that was just like a barracks you'd see at home. I remember guys who'd been there for a long time. They'd go over and flush the toilet and just watch it because they hadn't seen flush toilets in months.
Mm.
They had showers in there. It was just like a base in the U.S. Amazing. And then the next morning we got up and we got assigned to go to the various places in the perimeter. I drew the good straw, I guess, and I got to go to the officers' club, which was right on the river overlooking Da Nang. Da Nang was across the river to us to the west. The officers' clubs overlooked it, and we could look through the windows of the officers' club. We could see Da Nang, and over in Da Nang, we could see trucks and stuff, military vehicles lining up with lots of people just right across the river from us. And while we were there, all of a sudden we heard airplanes coming down, and I ran out and looked up to the sky, and there were airplanes coming towards us, and they were diving on us, and you could see like a World War II movie where the machine guns from the airplanes were shooting in the ground and stitching right across the ground right in front of us. Say, what the hell is going on? And then another guy dove at us, and the word came down. It said, "Do not return fire. Do not return fire." Colonel Kelly personally ordered us all, do not return fire. And we were used to shooting back at anybody that shot at us. So we weren't very happy about that. So this is another time my faith in our allies was not very good.
So this was not accidental. Some ARVN Air Force planes were actually shooting at them knowingly, presumably shooting at U.S.
We found out later on that they were shooting at something else, but they were hitting us. And the company that was there from 2-4, one of my classmates from basic school actually got wounded in that attack, and we had medevaced out of the country. Right across the street from that compound was an ammo dump, and the Vietnamese lieutenant colonel in charge of that ammo dump was threatening to blow it up if anybody started trying to kick him out of there. And he was part of the revolution. He was going to blow it up, and if that ammo dump had enough stuff in it, if he blew it up, it would blow up half the city of Da Nang.
So these stories you're relating, the incident at the bridge, the uprising in Da Nang itself, the ARVN soldiers presumably killing villagers' chickens, shooting, giving any VC or NVA that might be out there more information about we're here. But perhaps more importantly, taking those almost certainly from villagers, certainly not helping the cause of turning the villagers' hearts to the government of South Vietnam. Then you have a plane where they're attempting to blow up an ammo dump because an officer is part of the anti-government revolution. And here you guys are fighting for that government, losing Marines in the process. At what point in your life did all of this sort of come together in your mind and with the realization something is really wrong with this situation? If that never took place in Vietnam itself, was it after the war? Or when was it that you pieced all of this together and said, man, this does not make sense?
I think it, when it really came together was while we were still in Da Nang, and we went on patrols, and those Bouncing Betty mines were built to be hidden.
Mm,
And each one of our platoons had at least one very serious problem where multiple mines hit them on the same incident. And by the time that had happened, it was only June, and I had headed up to here with our allies.
So then what does the war become to you at this point when the folks whose country you're helping to save don't seem to be very interested in saving their own country? Then, and you've got a long way to go. You've only been in country a few months. You've got 9, 10 months to go. What does the war then become for you then?
Well, I think fortunately that's when we got moved up to the DMZ.
Really?
And
So that's interesting. You say fortunately, is that why fortunately? Because you go up to the DMZ, now you're dealing with the NVA and all of this. So
well, because while we were in Da Nang in the 3 months or so after that fort got abandoned and we stopped those people at the bridge, we had a lot of casualties due to those mines. And they're ugly casualties. I think we ended up going down to that fort and occupying it. I was told to take a certain part of that perimeter, and the lieutenant in the company that was there was somebody I'd known at the Naval Academy, a friend. And he says, we don't know where those mines are. There's still some in the perimeter. Don't go here, don't go there, stay away from this, et cetera, et cetera. And then they left. We spent the night there. And I took the first patrol out the next day. And this is down on, I think it's Highway 14. It's an east-west highway from roughly Hoi An, and it goes west along the Thu Bon River. I took the first patrol out. We were walking along, and I heard a big explosion behind me, and I knew what it was. We'd had enough of those mines. I went back, and when you step on one of those mines, it's a very ugly wound. This guy, he was, in my mind, the corpsman was working on him, trying to patch up the bleeding, but he was hopeless. One leg was severed somewhere below the knee, and the other one was pretty badly mangled. He was, in shock, not cognizant of anything. And then we had to get him evacuated. And I think another guy had something relatively minor, but he was somewhere up around his throat, and so he was bleeding pretty badly, and someone was holding his throat and trying to stop that bleeding. And so we had to get a helicopter. We called in for a medevac, emergency, etc. And when they said, okay, the helicopters are on their way, when they get in your way, you want to have a perimeter set up to protect them so they can come in. So I said, okay. I said to one of my sergeants, who was a squad leader, okay, Sergeant Matt, you go take that area and you'll be the enclosing the zone for the helicopter. So he started out and bang, there went another one. And I ended up, I got wounded. My platoon sergeant got wounded. 3 men got killed. And there were a total of eight wounded and three killed in that incident. That was the worst day I had in Vietnam. Roger Mathewson. Lance Corporal Rosenstock. James Hoss. I just had a minor wound and I was sent back out to the company, or I was sent back to the battalion headquarters to recuperate for a little bit. The next day, the platoon that I had been shadowing the lieutenant with, I think they were told to come back up to the battalion area. And they also encountered 1 or 2 of those mines on the way up. And the staff sergeant, who was the platoon sergeant, suffered a very serious wound. I think he lost both of his legs.
And these are mines that had been under the control of ARVN forces, and then somehow they had gotten into the hands of the VC.
Yeah. I mean, we were used to hitting booby traps, but few and far between. But now they had an arsenal. So that really started to sour things.
Yeah.
And about a month later, we were going out on an operation called Operation Liberty. And in Operation Liberty, we went over to Hill 55. If you're familiar where that is, it was a battalion headquarters for 1-9 at the time. And we went over there and spent the night, and then we hiked down south of that area and east for a dawn attack on an area below the Song Latho, which is the Latho River. That I was in the middle. The platoon on the left was to my north, and they were commanded by a staff sergeant. I think it was actually their staff sergeant was on R&R, and they were commanded by a sergeant. And then we had a brand new guy who had just been commissioned. He had been a first sergeant. They commissioned a lot of staff NCOs at that time. He was one of the first ones. He was the first one to join our company. He was commissioned and he was on the right. And the company commander was over with his group because they figured, well, there's not going to be any action on the left. You know, you're getting further south as we go from left to right. And we moved across, and all of a sudden we heard a boom over there. And it came to my left. And the company commander went over to see what was going on. We heard a couple more booms over there. And then I got the word by radio the company commander wanted to talk to me. I got up there, the company commander was lying there on the ground. Both of his legs were in very bad shape. Looked like he'd lose one or maybe both. He said, "You're now a company commander." Well, I recognized the explosions, so I wasn't expecting Nirvana. And so I went up there and he says, "Well, you got the company. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to move over here and clear this area today. And then tomorrow we're going to link up with another people over here.
But he just walks you through, this is the plan.
Yeah, which he was the guy who was in charge, so he knew the plan, but I didn't. So yeah, he had to pass on the word.
And as you're talking to him, is the corpsman working on him?
Oh yeah.
And was the captain sort of in that state of calm that comes with being in a kind of a state of shock, or?
Well, I don't know. He was obviously cognizant of what was going on. But and then as the corpsman, I don't know if the corpsman was working on him or working on someone else, because there were a lot of casualties up there. When at least 3 of those mines had gone off, and we had an air liaison officer with us, and they were running an airstrike on the river to our north because they were getting some fire from there. So there were a lot of things were going on. Didn't have time to reminisce.
So all of this then explains why you said, fortunately, we went back up to the DMZ.
Yeah. I mean, we had those mines were eating us up. And they were ugly wounds. You could see guys were going to be mangled for life. So it was very demoralizing. We got actually, called back from the operation, a day or two later, took us out of the operation because we were an ineffective company.
Because so many casualties as a result of the mines.
Yeah. And we had to basically rebuild the company. I mean, the second platoon, by that time now, 3 of the platoons, each of the platoons had one incident with multiple mines. And so I had 3 killed and 8 wounded in that one. And I don't know how many killed and wounded the next day in the other one. And now you got the second platoon. They really got crushed and lost the company commander in the 3rd incident. So by that time, I was pretty disillusioned with what was going on down there.
Is part of the difficulty here a sense of powerlessness? And here's what I mean. If you're in the DMZ and you have mortars coming in or artillery coming in, there are things you can do. You can move Marines over here. You can tell Marines to do this. But it sounds like these mines were just out there in such numbers that there's really it's just a crapshoot wherever you happen to step. And there's really nothing, there's no order you can give aside from the obvious, look out, be as careful as you can. But I'm guessing we're in some pretty thick brush here. Was that part of the difficulty, just as a commander, that you're kind of powerless? There's really not much you can do about this.
I'm sure it was. I'm not sure I thought about it in that way, but it was very disillusioning. And of course, I reflected back that this is what our allies have done to us
by letting the VC get their hands on those mines.
Yeah.
All combatants, or certainly most combatants, carry a certain burden that comes with having experienced combat, having seen what combat does to people. You've described the wounds. And I'm gathering that the officer has the additional burden of having been in charge. The E2 can say, I was just a little Marine, a little junior enlisted guy, and I was just there. I didn't give anybody any orders. I didn't have any responsibility. But you're the one with responsibility. As the years have gone by, and as you've looked back on that experience, do you feel that there are privileges that come with being an officer and that come with being in command, but perhaps especially for those who go through combat, I wonder if there are also additional burdens that come with having been the one in command. And then, reflecting back on what unfolded, do you think that's right, that the officer does carry additional burdens that a junior enlisted guy is just not going to feel?
I think it does. I, you wonder if there's something you could have done to have changed the outcome of any particular situation. And the one I regret the most is frankly, the last guy I lost. He was a corpsman, and Marines love their corpsmen, Navy guys. But he had been with us for almost 6 months, and the corpsmen, when they hit 6 months in the field, they went back to the battalion area, and they had a less hazardous job. And they went back to one of the medical battalions, etc. And this guy had joined us when we were on that at the rock pile. And he did a heroic job trying to save my platoon sergeant's life in that big firefight that I told you about. Because my platoon sergeant, who had just reported in, been there a week, he was killed in that firefight. And the corpsman did a heroic job while still under fire. I'd written him up for a medal, and he got it. He was looking forward to getting out of the company and back to the medical field, and not being in a rifle company anymore. And a couple days before he was to go, we were circling around to get behind somebody, and it's the hammer and anvil tactic. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but the hammer and anvil tactic, where you get one group behind here, and then you're driving. There's a driving force over here, driving towards the anvil. Well, we had to move to become the anvil, and while we were moving to the area, the driving force started shooting, and they got him, and he turns out that he got shot in what looked like a relatively superficial wound in the shoulder, but it had gone through into his lung, and he didn't make it. And I wondered if there was this, how are we going to go become the anvil if something happens I didn't think about? Well, maybe it's going to get sprung before we get there, or while we're on the way, and we're going to be just on the fringes and could be hit there. But that's what happened. That was the toughest one. Robert Nally. Now, I went on to go to flight training, became a pilot. And when it was kind of the same kind of a deal. When you're qualified in your airplane, you get orders to Marine Air Force's Western Pacific, and you know what that means. And so in 1970, I had orders to Marine Air Force's Western Pacific. It was, the flight over was a lot nicer than it was in 1966. Went in a commercial airliner this time. And got to Okinawa, and I fully expected to get orders to Vietnam. At Okinawa, it turns out there were, by 1970, there were a lot of people on their way back for a second trip. But when we got to Okinawa, all of the pilots of my airplane who had been to Vietnam, they said, "You guys are going up to Japan." And I was not unhappy.
Mhm.
about that.